Well, Alexis, I am glad that you could join me today and get to share some great things with the community regarding data management and infrastructure. So, do you want to kind of give just a quick introduction of yourself and the topic?
Sure. Well, I'm Alexis Perumal, and let's see. My background is in computer science, and I started my career as a software developer at HP in San Diego. Worked in digital imaging and got involved in digital photography and the whole transition into color in the office, going from analog photography, silver halide, into digital imaging, and worked in that space for a long time. And then really from the standpoint of software development, although I also at different points in my career got involved in managing other engineering disciplines like EE and mechanical engineering. And then I made a transition in my career to the life sciences, to Illumina, which is the world leader in DNA sequencing technology. And Illumina was very interested in my background in large-scale software development as the company was growing, and got involved in a lot of different things at Illumina, dealing with large big data sets of DNA sequencing data. And then I left Illumina actually in the middle of COVID and went to an Illumina spinoff called Grail, which works in the cancer detection space, and was actually asked to come in as Grail was growing, and was asked to build out the IT organization at Grail. And so I had a chance to do that, and I've been at Grail ever since, approaching 5 years at Grail. A lot has changed at Grail over that time period. There's been a lot of growth, and then also some challenges as well. And then my role has also evolved at Grail, and I'm now involved leading the DevOps, site reliability, and build engineering organization as well within our software development organization.
That's really cool. That is I mean, there's quite the evolution and diversity of experience. And even just, I was thinking about as you're talking about like introducing color and going from analog to digital in photography. And I was like, well, as we're going to jump into the topic of data, I was like, what we mean when we say data over the span of your career has changed a lot. Like what
That's
that
right.
looks like and what does it manage, and the complexity and the layers and the abstraction and all of it. Really interesting to think about. So I'm excited to kind of dive in. But yeah, if we're talking about data management infrastructure, give us kind of just what are we talking about there? Give maybe just a brief intro to that topic as it relates to entrepreneurs and founders.
Sure. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is there's a lot of different types of data, right? You have obviously your customer data that you probably care a lot about, right? Because I would think most entrepreneurs are very customer market focused. There's also internal data on your internal organization, your business operations. Of course, any entrepreneur is going to be focused on financial data, right? Because that's measuring how the business is doing. You could also think of in terms of like your goals and OKRs. You're going to have what they call KPIs, key performance indicators, and those are varied, but those will be typically quantitative metrics that you use to measure how well you're doing against your goals. So I would say first you should think about the different types of data you have. And then to your point, where does that data come from? Where does it go? How do you use it? And gosh, there's so much to think about there. So first, I would say, starting with the externally focused, I think you need to be very intentional about what is your contract with your customers and what are the expectations. Data can be very sensitive, and so before I would say like one of the very first things you should do in defining your data strategy is to think about what is that agreement that you have with your customers? What is that compact with them? And how do you respect and honor that? For example, at Grail, we're dealing with cancer detection. We've developed a test called Gallery that can detect early stage cancer from a blood test. And one of the scenarios, that we've talked about is, in politics, presidential politics, they talk about an October surprise just before the election. And you could imagine, if the main candidate, if there was data leaked about prevalence of, that they may actually have cancer, or maybe that they don't have cancer, right? Either way. So information about your health is very sensitive. So I would start by understanding what are those boundaries. And I think there is a tension there because I would say there's a tension there because the data can be very powerful and it can be very lucrative to you, right? You have the opportunity to gather analytics on what people are doing. There are opportunities to monetize that yourself. There are also opportunities for you to sell that data to data aggregators that is lucrative to you. And so I would say there's going to be a tension there, and you need to figure that out. And then it depends on the industry, right? Fintech or life sciences, the data is critical to the health of the business. Within the life sciences, of course, in the US, you have HIPAA, you have a lot of regulations around how you manage that data, and you need to be aware of that. GDPR in Europe, CCPA in California, and a lot of states are following that pattern. So you should be aware of those expectations, those requirements, and you should be respecting those. Even, I know the focus today is not cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a hot topic, but even from the standpoint of cybersecurity, the way I would describe it is that the inner sanctum of what people are trying to get is the data, right? That's what the bad actors are trying to get, is the data. So all of these things about getting access to systems or passwords and authentication or spoofing user accounts, those are actually a means to an end. Those are vectors that they're using to get to the data so that they can get the data themselves and maybe even take it away from you. And so it's maybe a little bit of an oversimplification, but you can almost think of your cybersecurity strategy as what do you need to do to protect your data fundamentally, and then everything layers on top of that. So I would say those are constraints you need to think about, and then from there to consider, like you were saying, like where does this data go? How is it stored? How long is it stored there? What is the data that you're collecting? Even how does your data move? And how does your data move across systems? And how do you ensure it's secure both at rest and in motion? Typically, another thing I would say is that typically, like if I think early in my career, we would be trying to solve a problem, and we would want to get a system to solve a problem. And pretty quickly, we began to realize that the magic is not what the system can do and what you can do in the system. The magic is how the systems stitch together, which actually gets to things like middleware, right? And how the data flows across systems. And then I would also say, analogous to that, the power is not just your data. The power is how does your data connect to other data and stitching that together. So I've said a lot. Maybe I'll stop there, and then we can go in whatever direction you're interested in.
It's good. It's like there's so many paths in there. But I love that you started there for us with like just the kind of the responsibility of stewardship over that data, of both what do I collect, how does it get used, how does it get protected, but then also then there's in a sense the stewardship of how does it get leveraged for good, how does it get used effectively, stored effectively, all of those things. So I really like that in both senses, I really hear you framing it as a stewardship of that data. Because I mean, especially like you're talking about in your spaces, in some of the life sciences, but really in probably most businesses, what we're storing is data about people. And,
Right.
because at the end of the day, whether you're B2B, B2C, whatever, you're there's some level of human to human, and there's a lot of human related data in there. And so we really do want to steward that well. So, well, let's kind of take that though, and then walk through some of these different stages of growth in our framework. And so that event, it can happen anywhere along the way. It can happen early in discovery or adoption. It can happen later, even after you've hit saturation. And an event can be good. It can be bad. It can be internal. It can be something of, the owner wants to exit somebody, there's a shift in departments. It can be a merger, an acquisition. It can also be external, like, it's someone else rising in the market, or something like COVID hitting, or the supply chain change, or a regulatory change. Like all of those can create these events where there's some kind of major shift, either in the business typically or in the market, and you're trying to navigate that. So yeah, you started talking about that. A little bit of data can help us predict, but also maybe I'd be curious, both not just predicting, but then navigating once you find yourself in that. How does data begin to really play a role in there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And these black swan events, right, can be market dominating, right? So, if you read the book, Black Swan, it talks about how a disproportionate amount of the returns in the stock market, people talk about, like maybe the stock market has returned since the Civil War, like maybe 7% annual growth above the rate of inflation, right? But it's not a steady line. And a lot of that growth are from these black swan events, the growth and the dips, right? And so I think for all of us, the most significant black swan event that we can think of is COVID, right? And that was huge. And that wasn't. And of course, with any disaster in the world, you can always find some guy that predicted it, right? You can always find somebody. But realistically, that was something that I think for the vast majority of people was totally out of the blue. Did not expect that, and the impact that had. And so I think you're asking, like, how does data help you deal with that? So I remember, like, when that happened, I was at Illumina, and I was both personally interested in data science as well as professionally interested in it. And we had built an instrument monitoring system for our sequencers, where there's a lot of telemetry from the sequencers that's sent back in terms of the health of the sequencers, the amount of sequencing, all kinds of telemetry, and of course with customer consent. And this was all instrument health data that we use, so that we could do things like proactive maintenance, even detecting, like, maybe when the part hasn't failed yet, but maybe it's showing that maybe it's more likely to fail soon, and then we could actually replace that part to maintain high availability, high uptime of these very expensive DNA sequencers. And you may recall, COVID hit first in China, in Wuhan, and initially the world was focused on what was happening in China. And I remember the CEO of the company wanted to know, like, well, what's happening in China, and what kind of patterns are we seeing? And so we were able to actually look at this instrument health data and on my team, we pulled this data together, and we were able to, almost like in near real time, track sequencing activity in China, and we can see the rate at which things started to come back. And we had immediate data that directly was applicable to us, even faster than consumables pull through, right? So you would know how much you're selling consumables, but there's a whole supply chain and there's inventory, right? This was real time, like, we're able to tell you how much sequencing happened last week in China compared to pre-COVID norms. And at the same time, I was playing with Tableau, and you might remember Johns Hopkins had their data set, and Johns Hopkins had charts where they would show how many COVID cases there were in different countries. And I remember I wanted to slice it a little bit differently than the way they were slicing it. I was very interested in seeing the patterns in different locations.
Right.
What do those curves look like? And you could see aggregate patterns for like the world, and you could see snapshots of where every country was, but you couldn't see the curve for a particular locale.
Right.
And that's what I was interested in. But then they also said, well, we're publishing all this stuff in Git, not just the source, but we're publishing these data sets, and there's a daily feed, and you can pull it. So then I said, okay. And so I started pulling that data, and then I started building my own Tableau dashboard by country of looking at these curves.
Yeah.
And then later, the New York Times started doing the same thing in the US at the local level, right? So you can get much more granular US data by state, or, much more local data, and we could graph that. And then, of course, as COVID developed, you could see what were, initially we cared about China, getting back to the sequencers, but then later you care about, you care about like your own county. And what's the rate, what's the knee in the curve, what's the likelihood that this whole county is going to be shut down. And so I would say it was extremely valuable to have essentially this like near real-time telemetry to see what's going on in specific geographies, and then getting back to the situation we had at Illumina, we started looking at pretty quickly. It's like, okay, well, not just China, what's going on in Italy, what's going on in New York, what's going on in the rest of the world, right? And then able to monitor that, because that had, and that ended up being a key tool that was used in the financial forecasting of the company, right? Because, a major part of Illumina's business is actually not the instruments that are sold, it's the consumables that get pulled in. So you have this fleet of instruments that normally are at a pretty steady state, but in this particular situation, because you don't have medical workers coming in to be able to operate them, you have a reduction. So I would say, the closer you can get to real-time telemetry, and maybe depending on the business model, maybe that just falls out. If your business is on the web, that information may just fall out. If you have other types of businesses, it may not be as obvious, but building the pipeline so that you have that telemetry. And actually, if I could just mention, one of the standard data stories that they talk about is that if you think of the space race, the Soviets launched Sputnik. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, at the same time, all the American rockets were blowing up, right? You've seen the Right Stuff or these movies, right, about the space race. And so in 1959, the US couldn't launch a rocket without it blowing up. In 1969, 10 years later, they landed on the moon and came back. So how do you go from all the rockets blow up to landing on the moon and coming back to Earth safely in 10 years? A fundamental part of that was that they had telemetry, meaning data from those rockets that was being sent in real time when they would launch the rocket. All of this data from the rocket is being sent to mission control. And then the rocket would blow up, but they had this large data set, and they were able to do
what happened, how to do that. Yeah.
And they were able to do root cause analysis, find what went wrong and fix it, and then launch another rocket, and then it would blow up, and then they would find another problem and fix it. And they were able to iterate this way, and they were able to do that because they had all that telemetry. Right? And even now, if you look at, it's pretty cool. If you look at like these SpaceX launches, when they launch a Falcon Heavy or something, you'll notice even just on the screen, all of the data, all of the quantitative data, the numerical data, right? You can see, so you see cameras, so you see visual data, but you also see, they'll have velocity, they'll have altitude, right? They have all these indicators of where they are in their mission profile. You'll notice they even have like, they'll show like maybe all their Merlin engines, and they're actually their little diagram will show you which of them are functioning correctly, or which of them are on, which of them are off if one malfunctions, right? So the point is the whole thing is instrumented as much as possible. Now, I'll get back to the caution I mentioned at the very beginning, which is to the extent you're instrumenting, measuring human behavior and collecting information on your customers, you got to be very careful with that data, right? You need to respect that. To the extent you're not doing that, to the extent it's your own systems, I think instrumenting that all up and monitoring that gives you the ability to, I think, better see what's coming and to react to it in real time when it's here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really insightful advice, Alexis. Is it's like to navigate the event well happens well before the event.
Right.
It's like if you want to be able to navigate these events, maybe even predict, but even if you aren't able to predict it, to be able to navigate it, it's like, well, you need to have been, plug in all the things to be able to have that data. One, kind of like you said, with the weighing yourself, you have the baseline of what was normal before, but also as it shifts, just like you're describing with that rocket, it's like if it blows up and you're like, oh, I wish, okay, next time we should have a something to measure the temperature inside, or we should have, all of a sudden, and some of that may be they iterated even on what they measured, I imagine, to a degree, but it's not that they started with no measuring, because otherwise there's just a lot more and more costly even iteration that happens in there, whether you're trying to get to space or trying to run a local business.
Yeah, and if I could nerd out for a second on this, also, so like I'm in the life sciences now, right? And if you look at Illumina's a world leader in DNA sequencing, and Grail, the company I'm at now, uses Illumina technology to detect cancer. So one of the things we haven't talked very much about is what's the history of data, or the history of big data. The original big data is our DNA.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's the big data that's in every cell of our body, right? That is
that way, but that's really interesting.
And it's digital data, right? It's one of 4 values at every location, right? So that was intriguing to me, that it's actually like digital data, and that a lot of the principles of data science and data encoding, not exactly the same way, but there are a lot of parallels between the way data is encoded in our body. And if you think of cancer is rapid, out of control cellular replication, out of control of the body. And it is the direct result of mutations in the DNA.
Right.
And so if you want to understand cancer, you need to understand what those mutations are in the individual. What's the mutation in the cancer cells that's different from the healthy tissue in your body? Right. So that's a data-driven discovery process. And then treatment of that cancer is optimized around what those mutations are. And a lot of the drug development in the cancer space now is around developing drugs that address cancer that is resulting from specific mutations in the cancer cells. I'm not talking about genes like BRCA1, BRCA2 that say you're more likely to get cancer. I'm talking about mutations occurred in the cells, in your cancerous cells. What are those mutations, right?
Like as the cancer grows and spreads, what mutations are occurring in essentially real time? Or
what are the mutations that led directly to that out of control growth?
Yeah. Right. Okay. I see. Yeah.
And then addressing that. So my point is that is a data-driven discovery process, and it's a data-driven response process. And this is a whole phenomenon of personalized medicine. It's dealing with that specific condition. Modern chemotherapy actually developed out of an incident that happened in World War II, where there was an American warship with chemical weapons on it that blew up in a harbor in Italy. A lot of people died, and when they did autopsies on those bodies, they found that those toxic chemicals actually slowed down the rate of tumor growth, right? So chemotherapy is toxic chemicals that are used to, because the cancer cells are actually growing more rapidly, they're actually more vulnerable to toxins, right? So that's the approach of chemotherapy. But my point is that that's a blunt instrument. That's like hitting your body with a baseball bat, right? Much better to go in very directly and deal with a specific cause. So I would say that that's an example from medicine, from the life sciences, of how I think of it as you're in a dark room, turn on the lights.
Yeah.
Right. And now you can see everything. Now it's very easy to navigate your way through it. Whereas, you can imagine if you're in your house in the dark, in the middle of the night, you wake up and you're trying to go into the other room, but the lights are off, you're going to bump into tables and things. Well, imagine if you're in somebody else's house and that happens. Now you have no chance. Then you turn on the lights, you can see everything. What is turning on the lights? Turning on the lights is the data, right? So having that data so you can see, and now you can navigate through it.
Yeah. No, you can't. Yeah, you can't evaluate what's not being recorded and what's not being seen, and you can't adjust without that evaluation. I think of it too. Yeah, even as you're describing turning on the lights, another metaphor is just, I think about driving. And it's easy to think about like driving. It's like, oh, my route is what Google shows me on my phone, and it's this line, and then I turn, and then there's another turn. But the reality is, like, you're constantly processing data and making adjustment. Like, you're never driving in a straight line. Like you're constantly making micro adjustments. And so kind of in the same way, running a business, you might be like, yeah, look, our growth was like this. And you're like, yeah, it was. But you were constantly making adjustments in there. And hopefully those were adjustments not made in the dark, but we're
right. So then this gets to what's the data for, right? So one part of the data is for finding opportunities, but then there's another part of it is around, like in the IT space, what I'd call monitoring and alerting, right? It's about monitoring your systems, seeing if there's indication of a problem, and then if there is indication of a problem, then alerting the appropriate people or even systems to deal with that. I mean, the way I think about it is from an IT standpoint, if a human tells me the system is down, that's a fail.
Okay, I see. Yeah,
especially if it's an end user, right? But what it really should be, the system's telling you that there's a problem with the system, right? Because it's being properly monitored. And I would say the same thing about your business. So if you think of just a personal health example, right? So what do you use your data for? I gave one example, which was your weight, right? Because then you're using weight as a proxy for your health.
Sure.
It's a limited proxy. We know that it's not perfect. We also know that it's better to have optimal weight. It's not just lower is better.
Right.
And you also know that weight's not everything, right? They'll say, well, you should also look at body fat, and and there are other indications too, right? But if you think of your own personal health, how do you use that data, right? You use it in a lot of different ways. You may set a goal. In this example we gave, right? You set a goal, and now you're measuring progress toward a goal. That's one way to use it. Another is like your Apple Watch, right? Your Apple Watch, it's also, if it detects defibrillation, or if it detects that you fell, right, then it's going to fire an alert, right? Maybe they'll call 911 or something like that, right? So that's monitoring. And then we gave the example of the rocket. That's a different usage, right? Where you have this telemetry and you have a catastrophic failure. Now you need to do diagnosis, root cause analysis, right? And if you have all of these different data streams now, or these different types of data, these different modalities, that allows you to do diagnosis, root cause analysis, right? And so I think these are all, different applications of the data, and it's good to think about these use cases and which are the more important ones to you based on your stage of the business, and then how do you instrument it up. But the point is, just like you're designing your product, you also want to be designing your data strategy and then building the infrastructure to support that, because this is the modern world and this is the way it works, and your competitors are doing it.
No, that's a good reminder. I appreciate you kind of walking through, in a lot of ways, just kind of a good overview of of how does data apply in there. So, well, cool. Well, as we kind of wrap up here, a couple of just more fun questions in here. What is Alexis? What's a favorite AI tool that you got?
Well, I think the best AI tool is your brain.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, that's a new answer. I have not gotten that one from anyone. I like it though.
I think it's and to think critically about these things. And I mean, honestly, I've just been using Gemini and integrating it into my life. I have enterprise chat GPT at work, and I have Gemini personally, and so I go back and forth between the two of them, and it's interesting to compare them. Honestly, I'm using Gemini in many ways as a substitute for Google search in many ways. And that's where I think Gemini actually does a little bit better than ChatGPT is with maybe more recent data. But to me, what's happening with LLMs right now is amazing because, well, I guess the way I would describe it is just taking a step back. I think of atoms and bits, right? Okay. And so if you think of the traditional economy, it's dealing with atoms. General Motors builds a car, right? You have products. You go to Costco, you buy stuff, right? These are atoms, right? And then the digital economy is about bits, right? Google, Netflix, right? These are all about bits. And in computer science, software is all about bits. Software is much harder to deal with atoms. It's easy to deal with bits. In large volumes of bits we can deal with. And so there's been a lot of work over the past few decades, right, to digitize everything. Why? Because it's like this high-speed superhighway. If you can digitize the information, we can process it and we can do things with it incredibly fast. If you're dealing with atoms, it's hard.
So the constraints are more readily apparent.
Everything is orders of magnitude slower, right? Like for example, in the backyard, you want to play soccer, you need a soccer ball, right? If I want to make 100 soccer balls, is it easy to do that in software with a digital soccer ball? Like if I can build one soccer ball in software, then I can create a for loop and I can make 100 million. It's easy. If you want to make 100 million soccer balls, you're going to make factories all over Pakistan, right, to do that, right? So there's been a lot of work to digitize the world, and even like actually, like I live in San Francisco with Waymo, right? Huge amount of effort. Right? I mean, if you want to make a car drive in a computer game, easy. You want to make a car drive in physical city streets, that's hard. Right? Those are the atoms, right? And this is the intersection of the atoms and the bits. And so Google is very powerful in this world of bits, much harder in the world of atoms. So all this work then goes into driverless cars, trying to figure out how you can apply the world of bits to the world of atoms, because if you can figure that out, then you have huge efficiencies, right? And so I guess the way I would think about it is computers from the very beginning deal with numbers. They can do math, they can do computation, and they can do it much faster than humans. And we've seen, decades of development. But language has been much harder, right? And but then what we see now with LLMs is you're able to vectorize language, and you're able now to bring language. I talked about atoms and bits. Now you're able to bring language into the realm of math.
Which is wild.
And math is something that computers know how to do really well. So it's an exciting time, and I think where this goes is not clear, right? I mean, there's a lot of speculation, but I think it is very profound, and what this looks like only time will tell. But I think it also creates a lot of opportunity.
No, I think it definitely does. It will be exciting to see. It's exciting, and then sometimes scary, where it's like, this feels like one of those, dystopian movies that I watched recently. When you see some things. But what we talked about a little bit, AI.
And actually, let me make one other comment too, if I may, and that is that, like, I think of it as like AI fundamentally. Like, what is AI? Because I remember, like, decades ago when I was studying computer science, we had AI, and I took AI classes, and it was an interesting curiosity, but it wasn't dramatic. It's now becoming dramatic. It's becoming dramatic, right? And what changed? Why is it dramatic? Like, what changed between then and now? I would say, well, it's so you have, I think, three elements that go into it, right? One is the data. Second is the compute.
Yeah, just the
And,
power of it.
and third are the algorithms,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what's happened with data? If I compared to like where we were decades ago, well, there's a lot more of it,
Yeah.
right? And that's what we were just saying, how everything is getting digitized, right? So I go do a workout, right? I have my heart rate monitor. I have all this digital data that's streaming into the cloud with my health, right? So a lot of health data, just as an example, right? Your house, right? You have temperature data. You can have temperature data from different parts of the house. You can have it all the time, right? I talked about the COVID data that we were able to get in real time during COVID. At least daily case counts from every county in the United States or every country, right? So you have this explosion in data. What has happened with compute? Well, it's Moore's law. Compute has gotten much more powerful, right? By orders of magnitude, both with CPUs and GPUs. And so, and then what has happened with algorithms? Well, there have been breakthroughs in algorithms, particularly with LLMs. And some of it is enabled by these other things. One of the things that's interesting with LLMs is that they realize that, often in life, you hit diminishing returns to scale, right? Where you do something, you see benefit. You do more of it, you see benefit. You see rapid benefit. But then if you keep going, you hit diminishing returns. But what they found with LLMs is that as your model size hits certain sizes, you hit a knee in the curve where all of a sudden, instead of just garbage, it actually makes sense. It's actually doing something coherent, right? And so, and it's hitting these knees at points that the amount of data and the compute power that we had 10 years ago was not sufficient. And then these algorithms now are taking advantage of that, right?
Right. Yeah. You get that critical mass in there.
Get that critical mass. And so I think that's where we are. And again, where that goes, I think we'll have to see. There's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of threat, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of excitement, and all of that is appropriate. But in some ways, though, I think it's following historical patterns. And I'm a big fan of history. And if you look at new innovations, the Industrial Revolution, computing itself, right, as these innovations came online and the impact they had on society and the concerns that people had with it at the time. Like I remember, I remember when I was in 8th grade, we would open up the math textbook and they would have us go to the appendix, and they would have tables in the appendix for things like logarithms or sine functions, or even, I don't know if they had square roots, but they would have these tables in there.
And then the calculator didn't do it.
Well, they would teach us how to interpolate. Now, we had calculators when I was in junior high, but like
graphing, could they do those, like the logarithmic stuff, or anyway?
Yeah, I mean they could do those functions, but the tables were still in the textbooks because the textbooks were from like 10 years ago.
Right.
And,
okay.
And it was still in the curriculum a little bit because the curriculum was from like maybe 5 years ago or something like that. So every once in a while they would say, okay, well, this is how we would do it, and you would interpolate between these values, right? But you don't have to worry about that. Just hit the button on the calculator. Right. There was this idea that, well, calculators are going to destroy education because nobody's going to learn any math because the calculator will do it for you. So these kids are going to be stupid, right? Well, they're not stupid, right? And then you could say the same thing about Excel and these tools that came on, right? So, so a lot of this, so I'm curious to see how it develops, but like this idea that LLMs are going to destroy education because nobody will ever know how to write because they have LLMs, right? Well, the reality is in the new world, we're going to have these tools at our disposal, and we will still be expected to add value. We will still be expected to contribute. But you'll have this tool in your toolbox, just like today you have a calculator available to you. But that doesn't mean you don't take math class. But it means you calculate a cosine a whole lot faster.
Yeah, I don't need a pencil and
right.
figured it out. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, Alexis, is that we homeschool our kids. We have 3 teenagers right now, and we were actually having this conversation over the last few years because growing up, and being in school in the 80s and 90s, and it's like okay, graphing calculators all kind of coming on the scene, and like I remember that conversation of like, oh, are you cheating by using these things? And it's like, no, that actually helped me when I also studied computer science in college, so it's like I couldn't have I can't imagine taking those math classes without some of those tools. It would have been a lot slower. But then, recognizing that same thing with our kids, where it's like, okay, I don't want to keep them from this. I still need them, like you say, they need to learn to write and communicate. But I'd rather them learn to be really good with these tools and, like you're saying, add value. And it's a continually changing space. And it's like, it's easy to be afraid of it, but it's also like, okay, how do I responsibly embrace it? But also recognize like, okay, there's some good things of like, okay, what do I not want it to become a crutch where they don't develop maybe some of those necessary competencies. So
in the old days in 3rd grade, they would teach people cursive.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to,
and
cursive is better than printing because I guess you don't have to raise the pencil as much, so you can do it a little quicker and blah, blah, blah. People need to be able to write letters because you need to be able to write letters because you'll spend your whole life writing letters. Well, nobody uses cursive, right? And because all of your communicating is really with your thumbs and Instagram. Totally. So the
we're gonna have thumbing classes for our kids.
Exactly.
They don't need any classes. They figure that out pretty fast.
Exactly. So I think the point is getting back to the data. The point is that it's the data that underlines all this, right? And so maybe if you think of data analytics, like traditional data analytics, it's it's a little bit like going from a calculator to a computer, right? It's a more fundamental stage, right? But I mean, that's actually the building blocks that AI is built on top of. And then I would also say for a company, like in many cases, you may not be aware of it, but it could be that when you go out in the future, that one of the most valuable assets your company has is that data set. And if you want to do AI, you're going to be doing AI on top of that data set. And and there's a lot of there are a lot of companies in the AI space, but what is truly valuable are proprietary data sets. But if you're not keeping that data or collecting it, then you may be one of your most valuable assets maybe slipping through your fingers.
That's a really good word. Yeah. Anything else like that you'd want to kind of, as we wrap up here, like you'd want to just kind of at a high level or at a even more specific like that, say to the founder, the entrepreneur who's kind of anywhere along that journey?
I guess I would say just don't be afraid of it. I think it's important that you put those guardrails in place at the very beginning and you protect those, right? That contract, both the contract that you have with your customers as well as, for lack of a better term, with regulators, financial or other type of regulators. Somebody said to me one time, well, who do you fear more, the hacker or the auditor? And I thought about that and I thought, well, actually both of them, because the hacker can kill you quickly and the auditor can kill you slowly. So I'm actually afraid of both of them. But I think the point is put the right frameworks in place, but then with those guardrails in place and then get into the game. And I think data is key to supercharging the business. I think it's also key to this world that we're moving into with AI, and it will allow you to play in that space. And then the tool stack, the tech stack will change over time. The processes will evolve. The people, you want the right people with the right perspective, just be thoughtful about how you lay that out.
No, that's really good. No, I appreciate you taking the time to just share your wisdom and your experience in it. Even though the topic was on data, it's really apparent. Yeah, you have a whole ecosystem of expertise that allows you to not only understand what's going on with data, but the good stewardship of it, the application of it, how it relates to strategy and business and bringing value to people. So definitely appreciate you sharing that with our community.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, right? That your data strategy needs to be holistic.
Yeah.
You can't just look at it as the bits and the bytes and what your data warehouse strategy is or your data lake.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Awesome.